Welcome to Residential Tech Talks. I'm Jeremy Glowacki, Executive Editor of Residential Tech Today. Today I'm talking to Joe Jones, the inventor of arguably the most successful robot ever made, iRobot's Roomba vacuum, and also most recently, the world's first residential weeding robot called Tertill. Joe, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Jeremy. It's great to be with you today.
I'd like to start talking about Roomba, first of all, because I'm kind of a neat Nick myself. I do find that when I've had too many cups of coffee, I tend to clean the house a lot. My kids call it an unhealthy obsession, but I think it's pretty good for the family. I don't actually own a Roomba because it would take too much of the fun out of my life, but I would love to learn more about it just because it's been such a successful product. What was it, like 15 million sold, or is it even more than that now?
Probably I think it's lately they've been selling about 1 million a year, a little over 1 million. I think the total is more like 20 to 25 million.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Yeah. I was looking at old numbers there. That's crazy. Yeah. How would you, can you pinpoint why the product has been so successful?
That's a really good question. Well, from my point of view, I think it's successful because finally we built a robot that actually did something that people wanted done. So I'm focused on the technology, and that's the part that I know best. And and of course, I attribute the success to the part that I had some doing and some say in the technology. But I'm sure that there's a lot more that goes into it than that. I think iRobot has been very successful at the way that they marketed the product. But on the other hand, since the last time I heard, there were like at least 17 different companies that were making robot vacuum cleaners. So I think it's pretty clear that robot vacuum cleaners serve a real need, that people actually want them and they're useful in their lives.
Yeah, so it's a successful category as well, but so clearly you hit on something there with your design. Before we get into talking a lot more about that, because I do want to learn more about the invention process and the design process, but I'd love to know more about your background in robotics in the first place. What's your educational background, and how'd that lead into what you're doing now?
So it sort of didn't. I mean, my educational background is that I majored in physics when I was in college, and I thought that I was going to become an experimental physicist. But when I was a kid, I was a tinkerer, always a tinkerer. I was always trying to build something and to make something work, and I was really interested in science and technology. So I went to college thinking I'd be experimental physicist, but then when I got to physics graduate school, I couldn't find any particular branch of physics that I was passionate enough about to work as hard as one has to work to get a PhD. So I got a job at a linear accelerator thinking that I would figure out my physics passion after a while, and 3 years later I hadn't figured it out. So then I took a trip around the world, and when I got back, it was a year later, they were hiring at the Artificial Intelligence Lab at MIT, and they were kind enough to give me a job there. And that was where I discovered that my true calling is robots, because it was just such an exciting, fascinating place. There's all these people working on these incredible algorithms and mechanisms, and I thought, I was convinced that within 3 to 5 years, robots were going to be everywhere doing all kinds of things. So when I started at the AI lab, it was 1982. So. Wow. You can do the math, and you know that 3 to 5 years after that, robots were not everywhere doing everything. So that gave me pause, and I tried to figure out why there weren't robots everywhere, and sort of that led to the thing that the principles that turned into Roomba eventually.
Yeah. So how does that process work at the Artificial Intelligence Lab, which I've been hearing about for many years, and it's just quite the mythical kind of place, I guess. So how do you go from developing iRobot in the lab, or developing the Roomba in the lab, basically, right? And then joining a company and becoming like an actual employee of that company.
So. Well, okay, the way that it happened was that in January of 1989, the mobile robot group at the AI lab had held this event that they called the Robot Olympics. And part of it was a talent show at the end of that. And they handed out kits of parts to anybody who was interested, who wanted to build any kind of robot that they could think of. Of course, you had only a month to do it because the talent show was going to be at the end of the month. And I came up with, so I had the opposite problem with you. I am not a natural born cleaner, right? I would like for my apartment to be clean, but I just don't want to do it. So I thought, well, I'll build a little robot that will clean the floor, and at least, you know, that part will be done. So I worked diligently for that month, and by the end of it, I had a robot that was mostly made out of Lego. It used the sensors and the microprocessor board that the mobile robot group had provided, and it rolled around the floor. It bumped into things, it turned away, and it kind of worked. It picked up a little bit of dirt, and it made me think that, you know, with more development, well, it wasn't robust enough, right? I couldn't just turn it loose in my apartment and by the end of the day it would be clean. It wasn't robust enough to do that, but it seemed to me that, you know, with just with some more development, with an actual company behind this kind of thing, that it was totally feasible. So that's where we left it at the AI lab, and then not too long after that, the lab ran out of money and I got laid off. But fortunately, iRobot was starting right around that time, so I became their first full-time hire.
That's good timing then. Okay.
It really was.
So you were still at the Lego stage when you joined them, or had you made it much more robust at that point?
No, I hadn't. And at this stage, this was 1991. So this was still a long time before they launched Roomba, which was 2002. So in the early days, so iRobot didn't have much money in the early days. So we're going from, you know, month to month, paycheck to paycheck. So they didn't have, there was no possible way that they could develop it on their own. So it kind of languished there for a while. We wrote a letter to Bissell, you know, the folks who make the carpet sweepers. And we said, you know, we have this wonderful idea for you. It's a little robot that will clean people's floors. And they wrote back to us and said, well, we won't read your letter until you signed a bunch of things. So we signed a bunch of forms, we sent them back, then they read our letter. And a couple of weeks after that, they said, well, nobody will pay more than $20 or $30 for a carpet sweeper, which is basically what you're advocating, so we're not interested. So it sat there for several more years until 1999, when iRobot finally had established itself well enough that they could contemplate developing something like Roomba.
Okay, so they got around to it on their own and got their own money in place and everything. So talk about the design, because I think that a lot of people would be more interested probably in that than the business end of things. But you're dealing with obviously trying to bounce off of things. First, you got that figured out early on, but then you have to deal with obstacles and hazards and that sort of thing. So there's challenges there, right? And
well, the thing that we had to figure out early on was basically how you're going to do it. There's this problem, at least as I see it in robotics, it's a problem that there's all these solutions that already exist. There's manual vacuum cleaners, and people know how to use those, and they think, well, that's a great solution. You put in a powerful motor and you run it around for a while, 10 or 15 minutes in your living room, and it's clean. So just make a robot that does that. But the problem, of course, is that people have these wonderful strengths that robots don't have. People know where it's dirty and where it's clean. They know where they've been. So if you have to make a robot that works the same way, that solves a problem in the same way that a human would solve the problem, you've made it impossibly difficult for the robot. So our idea was to rethink the problem from the ground up. So since a robot doesn't, in those days it was really expensive to have a positioning system that would let the robot always know where it was. It probably would have added $1,000 to the bill of materials for the robot, which would make it completely prohibitively expensive. So we had to come up with another idea. And that idea was that we'll just let it bounce around. And it'll take the robot longer to clean the floor than it would take a human being. But what else does the robot have to do, right? That's its only job. If it takes all day to clean the floor, that's fine. And then the other problem was, so a regular manual vacuum cleaner, the one you plug into the wall, quite typically draws 1,400 watts. So if I made a robot that drew 1,400 watts, it would, with the size of Roomba, with the battery that would fit in a robot like that, it would be out of power in a minute. So we couldn't use that. We couldn't use the standard vacuum motor that any other manual vacuum would have. We had to find a way to clean using much less energy. And ironically, we went back to the invention that Melville Bissell came up with in 1876. Because the carpet sweeper, if you consider a carpet sweeper, you just use your muscles to push it around, and it's pretty effective at picking up dirt off the floor. So it's way more energy efficient than a standard manual vacuum cleaner. So we put this carpet sweeper mechanism in the robot as a way of solving our energy problem. So you put those two things together, and we have what I consider a viable product.
Did you quickly have, as the product was put on the market, then was it the first on the market, or did you?
It was not.
Okay.
It was not the first on the market. The first on the market was a robot from Electrolux called the Trilobite. And it actually, they had been talking about it for several years before we started developing Roomba, but they actually put it on the market while development of Roomba was underway. So we sent a couple of folks over to Sweden. It was only available at one store, at the Electrolux flagship store in Stockholm. So we sent a couple of people over to Stockholm in the middle of the winter to buy a couple of these robots, and they brought it back. And we took them apart.
Yeah.
And we were really impressed with the technology that was in these things. They had this incredible sonar technology and
wow.
a number of really interesting things. In fact, they did a demonstration where they put a wine glass full of red wine on the floor, and they had the Trilobite come right up to it and turn away.
Nice.
So and that was great. But the problem with the Trilobite was it costs like $1,400.
Aha, yes,
so
the price.
People know what a vacuum costs, and it doesn't cost that much. So that was another constraint that we put on Roomba. It has to be priced close to what other vacuums are priced. So our initial target was $100. We wanted to make a robot that cost $100. We couldn't do that, and we were kind of disappointed, but we got the price of the original Roomba to $200. And so that compared to the Electrolux meant that, the Electrolux didn't really have a chance, since they both cleaned about equally well.
Yeah. What other design challenges do you think that other companies face that you were able to be successful with Roomba? I read about how many iterations you kind of came up with to solve different problems, and that others maybe went to market a little quicker and didn't happen to reach all of those design levels that you had reached. What were some of the things that you found that needed to be fixed?
So I really think that the difference between what we did at iRobot and what the other companies did was basically a mindset issue. It was I'd always thought that roboticists love robots to death. What they want to do is to make them as high tech as possible. They want to strap on as many bells and whistles as they can. And we had the opposite idea. We thought that if you build a robot that just does one thing and does it well, it has a big advantage over some robot that costs a lot more and supposedly does a whole bunch of different things. So it was mostly that we didn't do stuff rather than that we did do stuff that made Roomba successful.
Okay, before we continue our conversation, Joe, I want to take a short break for a word from our sponsor.
Thank you for listening to Residential Tech Talks. Today's broadcast is brought to you by ELK Products, a leading designer and manufacturer of customized security, automation, and energy management solutions for home and business with unsurpassed product quality and technical support. Secure, reliable, innovative. Control at your fingertips. Find out more today. Go to elkproducts.com.
Welcome back. I'm talking to Joe Jones, inventor of the Roomba. I'm sorry, I don't say it enough out loud. It's one of those things that's ubiquitous in our culture, and it's a fun product. I know that you gained a lot of experience working at iRobot, but then you did venture out on your own and start another company. Can you tell us about when that happened and what your move was all about there?
Yeah, so I've been at iRobot for almost 15 years, and the focus of iRobot was on robots for consumers for the home, and I wasn't sure that the next big thing in robotics would be a consumer product for the home, something related to floor cleaning. So in order to do something else, had to go somewhere else. So I and some other folks from iRobot started this company called Harvest Automation. And what Harvest Automation did, well, actually, when we started the company, we didn't know what we were going to do. So we spent the first few months looking around, and we found this interesting application that none of us had ever heard of before, and it's called spacing. And at nursery farms and greenhouses, when they produce plants, potted plants that you'd go into a garden store to buy, they produce like 2 billion of these a year across the United States. And one step in the life cycle of these potted plants is where first they're put on the ground outdoors close together. And then as the plants start to grow, if you don't move them apart, they'll grow into each other and damage each other and you can't sell them. So they do this thing called spacing, where they move the plants a little bit apart. And it takes an army of people to do this. And when we ran across this application, we thought, well, if we can't build a robot that does this, then we're in the wrong market. Mm-hmm. We shouldn't be building robots. So we spent a few years building a robot that would do that, and it actually worked. It's employed now. I think there's maybe 30 to 50 customers across the United States that are using this to space potted plants in their nursery and greenhouse farms.
Oh, interesting. I've done that. I've tried to be a gardener too, and less successful, I think, than my cleaning habits. But yeah, that thinning of those, you want to keep all these little plants like growing right all together, and then you realize that's not gonna work out so well.
Right.
So you were doing that for a while. How did you quickly move on to your current robotics company, Franklin Robotics, or were there other things? I
didn't quickly move on to it. It took I was there for about, at Harvest Automation for about 10 years.
Oh, okay.
But the market, Harvest Automation was VC funded, and the market wasn't really growing fast enough for the VC backers. So the interest started moving to another place, and Harvest Automation started investigating warehouse robots. And that's an interesting thing. And I think that there's lots of warehouse robots. People are developing them now. But the issue with the warehouse robots, the big challenge is the central software system. And I don't care about centralized software, right? I like robots that go around and do their own thing.
Right.
So I had been looking for other things that robots could do in agriculture while I was at Harvest. And it seemed like, weeding farm fields is a great application, and it would be wonderful if you could build robots that could do that competitively. But I couldn't think of any approach that was better than what I saw other people already doing, so I didn't really jump into that. And then in 2015, I went to a conference in Cambridge, Massachusetts called Robo Madness. And there I ran into an acquaintance of mine who suggested building a robot that weeds home gardens.
Okay.
And it turns out that the problem is just different enough that although I didn't think I could build a robot that weeded farm fields, I did think I could build an economical robot that would weed home gardens. And the big challenge in building a robot for weeding is, how do you decide what's a crop and what's a weed?
Sure.
Right. And most of the folks who are looking at that have decided that use a vision system. Use a vision system and you train it you use machine learning techniques to train it. And although there's a lot of activity, I'm not aware of any actually commercially successful product that does that. So I wanted a different way. I didn't want to have to depend on a research project coming to fruition before I could build a robot. So what we decided on for our robot, So now I've gotten to after harvest. I left about that time to start Franklin Robotics. And what we decided to do for our robot was to distinguish weeds from crops based on how tall they were.
Okay.
So, so that's viable for a home garden, because if you plant a seed, or if you have a little seedling that's a short plant that's growing in your garden, you can protect it with a plant guide, or something like a tiny little tomato cage.
Mm-hmm.
And then it makes sense to put them around all of the seeds, or rows of seeds, something like that. But if you're growing 1,000 acres of corn, putting a little tomato cage around every corn seed is just a non-starter.
Sure.
Right. So that was why I thought, well, this product will work in the garden, but I don't yet know how to make it work in a farm field.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that sort of led us in the direction that the product ultimately went.
Well, one of our writers, Jay Basin, actually introduced me to you, and he's reviewed Tertill, which is the product that you came up with, to weed gardens. And it was interesting to read about his experience with it, and how, unlike your typical weeding experience, you're not trying to pull the root out, you're actually decapitating the weed so that it just is basically kept from growing and demoralized. And since it's doing it all the time, just like the Roomba is
Right.
cleaning all the time, it's not going to complain about doing this like tedious job that no human really wants to do, right?
Yes, exactly. And that goes back to the point which I think is essential in robotics. You really have to think about doing whatever task you want to do. You have to reimagine that from the ground up. You can't just copy what people are doing, again, because people and robots have different strengths. A person can walk out into the garden and they can see that's the weed that I want to pull and pull it. The robot has a much harder time doing that. But the robot has eternal patience, right? It'll live in the garden. It'll work for a few hours every day, and it'll come back. It'll chop the top off of a weed one day, and it grows back. It'll come back the next day and chop it off again, and eventually the weed runs out of energy and it dies. So the only way that we could build a product like Tertill is if we reimagine the task and did it in a way different from the way that people do that task.
Did you have to do a little bit of research in plant science to know that about weeds and how they do eventually die? Or is it just you kind of observe it happening? How's that all work?
Well, I remember one thing that I did while I was at Harvest. I went to this really interesting agriculture conference. I'd never gone to an agriculture conference before. It was in Hershey, Pennsylvania. And there was a guy talking about weeds. And he gave the example of the yellow nutsedge. I'd never heard yellow nutsedge before, but it's a tough weed. And the thing that makes it so tough is that yellow nutsedge has these nodules that grow underground. So when you chop the top off, it'll grow back. You chop it off again and it'll grow back. But the speaker told us that if you do this 8 times, yellow nutsedge dies. Okay. So that was sort of what I knew about weeds.
That's stuck in your mind. Yeah. I mean, I'm actually familiar with that weed. It's quite invasive, and it sticks on everything. It's just like you can't pull up from one spot. It's a wild one. And that's interesting to know. I did not know that about weeds. So you're already ahead of me on the knowledge base to where you're going with it. And the fact that you then have to just figure out a robot that's mobile through a different terrain than a flat carpet, for instance, like with Roomba, right? That's a challenge for you, mobility.
Mobility was a great challenge. I mean, you have 2 opposite constraints. On the one hand, you want to make the robot as small as possible so you can get between the crops that people have planted, and sometimes they plant them fairly close together. On the other hand, the terrain in a garden can be, arbitrarily rough. So you have to make this tiny little machine that can move around and not fall in holes and get stuck. So we basically worked a year. We spent a year just iterating on that challenge of making the robot as small as we could and yet mobile enough to get around a typical garden so it wouldn't get stuck.
Are there examples that you follow with that, or it's just trial and error with different wheels types and angles and that sort of thing, and height?
Well, you always look at the stuff that other people have done. So there's a lot of work in off-road mobility, and one thing that we looked at for a while is, I've forgotten what they're called, but there's these devices that have like 2 cylinders on either side of the device that touches the ground, and the cylinders have like a screw going around it, so that the cylinders turn, and then they can go through mud or through swamps or whatever. So we worked on that. In fact, you can get a toy. We got a toy that does that, and we played with that for a while, and it wasn't quite the right thing. So you try to ride on what other people have already done, and sometimes you find things that work, and sometimes you don't, and you just have to go trial and error. That was sort of how we got. So the wheels on Tertill are not, they're not up and down. They have a huge amount of camber, like 45 degrees worth of camber, and that was one of the things that we ultimately got led to trying to solve the constraints of trying to make it something which was tiny, it wouldn't tip over. So by giving the wheels a lot of camber, we could get the bottom of the wheel out to the edge of the robot, so we could give it as large a wheelbase as was possible to keep it from turning over. And it also, having the wheels splayed out that way, gave us more room to put the whacker, so it'd have a bigger, it could swing around in a larger diameter. And there was another 1 or 2 things, like one thing you have to worry about with outdoor robots is getting high centered. That is, it'll drive over a rock or a clod of dirt that'll raise it up just enough so that the wheels aren't on the ground anymore, and then it's stuck. So having the wheels building in the way that we did, with the wheels sort of diagonal, meant that there's a lot more area underneath the robot that's spinning that can provide mobility. So if the rock hits the wheel, you still have some chance that you're going to be able to get off of it. So okay. That's why it took us a year to get to the design that we ultimately ended up with.
And is it like a string cutter underneath? I forget what the whacker is.
Yes, we're just using the same kind of whacker string that handheld weed eaters and such like use.
So how much maintenance is involved for the actual owner of this product in terms of pulling string out or doing different things to keep it working? Yeah,
the ideal is 0. We haven't quite that you just put it in the garden in the spring and you take it out in the fall and you never have any weeds in between. It takes a little bit more than that. The whacker string does wear out, and it wears out faster. Actually, how fast it wears out mostly depends on how many rocks you have in your garden. It's not that it's worn down by the weeds so much, it's worn down by the rocks and soil. So if you have a lot of rocks, you might have to change the whacker string, once a week. If you have very few, maybe you can get away with a month.
So it's really all about getting prepped at the beginning of the season, getting everything set up, the plants properly spaced, the rocks taken out as much as possible, and then it'll take the pain away from gardening for the season.
Yeah, you set your garden up. You give it you give your plants enough space so that Tertill can get through, which is also often a way of getting more yield out of each plant, because now they're not interfering with each other with the casting shadows and such like. So you get that set up. You put a border around the garden so that Tertill doesn't wander away out into the yard. And a few basic things like that. It should be, it doesn't have to be pathologically smooth. It has to be fairly like rake smooth. If you rake your garden with like a leaf rake or something, you'll make it smooth enough that Tertill can operate. You do that, and you don't have to worry about weeds, which is a big boon for me, because the first time I tried to do a garden myself, I meant to be really diligent about weeding. I meant to get there at least once a week. And it never happened. And after a while, I came back from vacation and I couldn't tell where the crops were and where the weeds were, just all one big green mass. But now my gardens are much, much better. I don't have to worry about that anymore. There are very few weeds in my garden these days.
So you are applying the Tertill at your own home then?
Absolutely. We thought that was essential. That was one of the reasons that we were able to be successful with Roomba, because everybody on the team was a customer.
Okay.
Right? We all had floors. So I wanted to be a customer for Tertill. So I basically put in a garden so that I could design a robot.
And it's important to mention that it's a solar powered product, correct?
It is absolutely solar powered. There's no charging is involved.
Nice, very nice. Well, as a robotics inventor, are you always sketching ideas? Are you always seeing potential in things, or is it just one of those where the big idea comes every few years, and you're lucky when you can grab onto that in your head. Like, how's that work?
Both.
Okay, sure.
I'm always looking for an application that a robot can do, but there's a lot of constraints on that application, right? It has to be something that that you can do with the technology that you have right now, because you don't want to build you don't want a research project on the critical path, and it has to be something which is economical. When you build the robot, it has to be competitive with whatever other solutions people are doing now. And that's probably the hardest part. People get excited about robots and they want robots to do everything. And they forget that, well, okay, you could build a robot that does that, but here's this other thing which would cost 1/10 as much. And you're never going to sell your robot when that's the case. That's probably the hardest part when you're trying to find a robot application. It has to be better with the robot, cheaper with the robot than with whatever people are doing now.
Right. I mean, I think that what I've heard a lot of people that develop products, and the limitations on price are often the part that drives so much of the creativity. You have a big idea, and that's such an important part of it, because some of us just aren't inventors, and can't think of what the new thing would be. You think of the new thing, but then you're like limited by these parameters, and that's when you go to work, right? That's really the fun part of making it all happen.
Absolutely. It's the constraints that make it fun. When you're up against a bunch of hard constraints, you have to come up with something new. You can't just use the whatever standard solutions there are, because if that worked, then that product would already exist.
Exactly. Well, I know that you're focused on Tertill right now, but are you looking ahead at any categories that you could reveal without giving away any secrets?
Well, I will say that we're going to focus, as a company, we're going to focus on Tertill for the next few years, and we won't be doing anything other than that. But in the long term, I think that I am learning now how to solve the herbicide problem on farms. So having solved the problem of weeding in a home garden, I think I could now solve that problem for farms in a way that would be much less expensive than at least than other robots that I have seen that are trying to do that. So I'm looking forward one day to being able to work on that.
Well, to reduce chemicals used in agriculture would be a huge accomplishment for Earth, for mankind.
That's the big dream, yeah.
For sure. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time today, Joe. It's been a pleasure talking to you and getting to know your process better. And thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been great fun.
Yeah, and thank you to everyone else for joining us. Be sure to comment, share, or subscribe to this podcast. You can check out all the latest residential tech news at www.restechtoday.com. Until next time, please stay healthy and safe, and do not hesitate to reach out to me if you have a great story to tell.
Residential Tech Talk. Autonomous device, smart home, smart house, smart house.